The city woke before the sun, and the tall glass tower in the center of downtown was already glowing with life. Inside the top floor of that building sat a woman who many people called unstoppable. She was the CEO of a company everyone in the city respected. Her decisions shaped the future of hundreds of employees. Her words carried weight in every meeting, and her confidence could silence a room. But when the glass doors closed and the lights dimmed, she was just a woman sitting in a wheelchair, wondering if her strength was only a show. Every morning followed a routine. She woke before dawn, rolled to the window of her penthouse, and watched the sunrise paint the sky. That quiet hour was her favorite, not because of the beauty outside, but because it was the only time she could breathe without pretending to be fine. The world saw her as powerful, but she knew how fragile her heart still was. Years ago, a car accident had changed everything. She had been driving back from a late meeting, rain pouring down, her phone lighting up with messages she shouldn't have been reading while driving. One sharp turn, one blinding light, and then silence. When she woke up in the hospital, the doctors told her the truth. She would never walk again. That single sentence had crushed her world. She remembered staring at the ceiling, unable to move her legs, feeling like her life had ended even though her heart was still beating. But she was not the kind of person who gave up easily. After months of therapy, she returned to work, determined to prove that she was still capable of leading. And she did. She rebuilt her company, grew it stronger than before, and gained more respect than ever. But no one knew the silent war she fought every day. The moments when she dropped something on the floor but didn't bother picking it up because it reminded her of what she had lost, or the nights she cried quietly so that no one could hear. Her assistant, who had been with her for years, was one of the few people who understood her routines. Every day he brought her coffee at exactly 8 a.m., helped set up her meetings, and made sure everything was perfect. To the rest of the world, she was untouchable, strong, focused, maybe even cold. But he had seen glimpses of her human side, especially on the days when she'd stare out the window too long, lost in thought. That morning was different. Her company was expanding, and a new project had just started. A new office building that would represent the future of her brand. It was the biggest project they had taken on in years. She was proud but also nervous. She knew this project could define the next chapter of her company, and deep down, she wanted it to define the next chapter of her life too. When she reached the construction site later that day, the air was filled with dust and the sharp sounds of machinery. Workers moved around efficiently, and the smell of wet cement filled the air. She rolled through the site in her wheelchair, wearing her sharp suit and calm smile, giving instructions like she always did. People moved aside with respect, not pity, and she liked that. She had trained her staff to see her ability, not her disability. But among the workers, there was one man she hadn't seen before. He wasn't loud or flashy. He was focused, helping others lift heavy materials, checking blueprints, and occasionally laughing with his crew. He looked like someone who knew hard work, not just in his hands, but in his soul. When she passed by, he nodded politely, not staring at her wheelchair like most people did. That simple gesture caught her attention. For once, someone wasn't trying to figure her out or pity her. He just acknowledged her and went back to work. Later that afternoon, during a meeting at the site, he entered the temporary office carrying a set of revised plans. "Ma'am," he said simply, placing the papers on the table, "we found an issue with the flooring structure. If we don't fix it now, it could cause problems later." His tone was calm, respectful, and direct. She studied him for a moment before replying, "Then fix it. I don't like problems later." He nodded and left without unnecessary small talk. Something about his attitude stayed with her. Maybe it was how naturally he spoke to her, as if her wheelchair wasn't part of the conversation at all. It felt strange but refreshing. She wasn't used to that. Most people were overly careful with their words, afraid to offend or awkwardly pretending not to notice. But he was different, steady, grounded, almost disarmingly genuine. Over the next few weeks, she visited the site regularly. Each time, she found herself watching him from a distance, curious about the way he worked. He treated everyone equally, whether they were junior workers or senior managers. He never raised his voice, but everyone listened when he spoke. Once, she overheard a worker say he was a single father, raising a little girl on his own. That piece of information somehow made him even more human in her eyes. She didn't know why she cared, but she did. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, she stayed behind to review some documents. Most of the crew had already left except him. He was still working, tightening bolts on a steel frame. When he noticed her struggling to move a heavy folder onto the table, he walked over quietly and asked, "Do you need a hand?" She hesitated, pride making her want to refuse, but the folder slipped again. He caught it gently before it hit the floor, placed it on the table, and stepped back. "Thanks," she said softly, trying to keep her voice composed. "No problem," he replied, then smiled. A small, kind smile that stayed with her even after he walked away. That night, as she drove home, she kept thinking about that smile. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was just human. The kind of smile that reminded her she wasn't invisible beyond her title. For so long, people had treated her as the CEO, not as a woman who had fears, hopes, and fragile emotions. Somehow, that brief moment had broken through the wall she'd built around herself. The next few days, their paths crossed more often. Sometimes he'd hold a door open for her without making it feel like a favor. Other times, they'd exchange short conversations about the project. He once told her about his daughter, how she loved painting sunsets and how he worked extra shifts to afford her art supplies. She found herself listening more than she expected. His life was simple, but it had something hers didn't: warmth. At the office, her team started noticing a small change in her. She laughed more easily, smiled during meetings, and didn't seem as distant. No one knew why, and she didn't explain. But deep inside, she was beginning to feel something she hadn't felt in years: connection. One rainy afternoon, she was reviewing plans when the wheels of her chair got stuck in the muddy ground at the site. She tried to move forward, but the wheels spun uselessly. Before she could call for help, he appeared out of nowhere, holding an umbrella over her. "Looks like the rain doesn't care who's in charge," he joked lightly. She couldn't help but laugh. "Apparently not," she said. He knelt down, carefully cleared the mud around her wheels, and pushed the chair free. "There," he said, straightening up. "You're good to go." She thanked him, and this time she didn't hide the gratitude in her eyes. When she returned to her car, she sat quietly for a long moment, watching the rain hit the windshield. She realized she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not pity, not admiration, but comfort. It was strange how someone who had no power in her world could make her feel seen in a way no one else did. That night, she looked through old photos of herself before the accident, standing tall, smiling freely, full of life. For the first time, she didn't feel anger or sadness. Instead, she felt hope. Maybe strength wasn't about never falling. Maybe it was about finding someone who reminded you that you could rise again. She didn't know what the future held, or if this new connection would ever become something more. But deep inside, something had shifted. For years, she had lived behind walls built from fear and pride. Now a simple act of kindness, a steady voice, and a few shared moments had started to break those walls down. And as she went to sleep that night for the first time in years, her dreams weren't about what she had lost. They were about what might still be waiting for her. The morning sun slipped through the tall windows of her office, painting the room in soft gold light. She sat at her desk reviewing project reports, but her mind was somewhere else. The sound of the construction site still echoed in her head, the chatter of workers, the hum of machines, and one calm voice that somehow stayed with her even in silence. She tried to focus, yet his words from the other day kept replaying. "Looks like the rain doesn't care who's in charge." It had been such a simple thing to say, yet it made her smile every time she remembered it. She wasn't used to people treating her so naturally. Most spoke to her with careful tones, afraid of saying the wrong thing. But he never did. His way of talking was honest, light, and strangely comforting. That week, the construction project became her favorite reason to leave the office. She told herself it was about keeping track of progress, but deep down, she knew it was also because she liked being there, around him. Every visit, she found herself noticing small things: how he talked to his team, how he listened before giving instructions, how he never complained even when things went wrong. One day, she arrived earlier than usual. The air was cool and the sky was still pale. Workers were setting up, carrying tools, and chatting casually. He stood by the half-built frame reading blueprints. When he saw her, he smiled and walked over. "You're early today," he said. "So are you," she replied. "Habit," he said, glancing around. "I like being here before everyone. It's quieter. Gives me time to think," she nodded, feeling the same way. Early mornings had always been her favorite. when the world hadn't yet demanded anything from her. They talked for a few minutes about the project, but the conversation slowly drifted away from work. He asked about her company, how she started it and what it felt like to run something so big. No one ever asked her that with real curiosity. Usually people asked because they wanted advice or opportunity. But he just wanted to know her story. It wasn't easy, she said quietly. People see success, but they never see the struggle behind it. I get that, he said. Sometimes people think I just build walls and fix roofs. They don't see the long nights or the days I worry about bills or my kids' school. She looked at him curiously. You do it alone, don't you? Raising her? He nodded with a small smile. Yeah, she's my whole world. There was something in the way he said it, gentle but strong. She admired that. They spoke for a while longer until the site started filling up and he had to return to work. But even after he left, she couldn't shake the warmth that conversation had left in her chest. Over the next few weeks, their connection grew naturally. Sometimes they shared coffee in the morning before the workday started. Other times they exchanged small jokes that made her laugh, something she hadn't done freely in a long time. Her staff noticed the change in her. She smiled more often and her voice carried a lighter tone. Even the office atmosphere felt different. One afternoon, during a progress meeting, she watched him explaining a design adjustment to her project managers. He spoke with confidence, not arrogance. He was clear, practical, and respectful. When one of the managers tried to cut him off, he stayed calm, explaining his reasoning without raising his voice. She noticed how people listened to him, not because of his position, but because of his presence. After the meeting, as everyone left, she said, "You're good at that." "At what?" he asked. "Making people listen without forcing them to." He chuckled softly. "When you're a single parent, you learn to reason instead of shouting. Doesn't always work with my daughter, but it helps here." She smiled. "That's a good skill. Even I struggle with that sometimes." "Maybe that's what makes you human," he said quietly. The words caught her off guard. For a long time she had tried to be perfect, to never show weakness, never stumble. But when he said that, something shifted inside her. She realized she didn't have to be strong all the time. That evening she stayed longer than usual. The sun dipped behind the city skyline, and the lights of the site flickered on. Most workers had gone home, but he was still there, checking something near the scaffolding. She rolled closer and they ended up talking again, this time about life beyond work. He told her about his childhood, how he'd started working at a young age to support his family, how he learned to fix things by watching his father. She listened quietly, fascinated by the simplicity and honesty in his words. Then he asked her gently, "Do you ever miss it?" "Miss what?" "Walking." It was the first time anyone had asked her that so directly. Usually people avoided the topic completely, pretending it didn't exist. She paused, staring at the dim glow of the construction lights. "Every day," she said softly, "but I've learned to stop showing it. People look at you differently when they know you're hurting." He nodded slowly. "Maybe, but sometimes letting someone see it helps." His words lingered long after she drove home that night. For years, she had locked her pain behind confidence and control, but now it felt like someone had quietly turned the key. Days turned into weeks and their friendship deepened. They talked about small things, food, music, memories, but somehow every conversation left her thinking. She began to see that kindness didn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it came from being seen, truly seen. One morning he brought her a cup of tea when she arrived. "Thought you might need this," he said with a grin. She smiled. "You didn't have to." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." It was a simple act, yet it warmed her heart. She realized that it had been years since anyone had done something thoughtful for her, without expecting anything in return. One day, she invited him to visit her company headquarters so he could understand how the new building would fit the brand's vision. He looked uneasy at first, standing inside the sleek, modern office filled with expensive furniture and fast-talking executives. But she stayed beside him, introducing him to people, making him feel at ease. She could tell he didn't fit in that world, not because he wasn't capable, but because his world was built on honesty and effort, not polish and titles. During lunch in her private office, he looked around and said, "You built all this." "With help," she said modestly. He shook his head. "Still, not many people could do what you did. You turned something painful into power." She smiled, but her voice softened. Power doesn't mean peace. Sometimes the louder the world claps for you, the lonelier it feels. He didn't say anything, but his eyes told her he understood. That quiet understanding meant more to her than any words could. Later that day, when he left, she found herself standing by the window, watching the city below. She realized that for the first time in years, someone had spoken to her like a person, not a symbol of success or a story of tragedy. Their bond continued to grow, though neither of them said it aloud. She began to look forward to his presence. The calm in his voice, the way he made everything feel simple, the way he looked at her without judgment. He reminded her that there was still beauty in small moments. One evening, as they watched the sunset over the site, he said quietly, "You know, sometimes I think strength isn't about never breaking. It's about what you do after you've been broken." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fading orange light. "And what do you do?" she asked. "I build again," he said, "one piece at a time." She smiled, feeling her throat tighten. Those words described exactly what she'd been trying to do all along. As the sky darkened, she realized that something was changing inside her. The walls she had built to protect herself were slowly falling. She wasn't sure where this connection would lead. Maybe friendship. Maybe something deeper. But it had already given her something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. And as she drove home that night, with the city lights twinkling around her, she whispered to herself, "Maybe standing again isn't about my legs. Maybe it's about my heart." The days were getting warmer, and the new office building was finally taking shape. Each week brought fresh progress. New walls, clean glass panels, and bright floors that reflected the light of early mornings. She visited often, sometimes under the excuse of checking on details, but mostly because she liked being there. Something about that place felt alive. Maybe it was the sound of work happening, or maybe it was because every time she arrived, he was there. They never planned their meetings, yet somehow their paths always crossed. He always greeted her with that easy smile that reached his eyes. It wasn't forced, it wasn't polite, it was real. That was rare in her world. Her life had been filled with people who smiled because they wanted something. But his smile didn't ask for anything. It simply said, "I see you." One afternoon, she arrived at the site to find everyone rushing around. Something had gone wrong. A piece of equipment had jammed, delaying work on the main structure. Voices rose, tempers flared, and the site that usually ran smoothly was now full of tension. She watched quietly, feeling that familiar pressure build in her chest. She hated delays, hated anything that felt out of control. Then she saw him. He was calm, walking between the workers, checking the situation himself. He didn't shout. He didn't blame anyone. He just observed, gave instructions, and within minutes, things started moving again. Watching him, she realized why people followed him, not because of authority, but because of trust. When the chaos settled, she called him over. "You handled that well," she said. He shrugged. "I've seen worse. Machines break, people panic. It's part of the job." "Still," she said softly, "you stayed calm." He smiled. "Someone has to." She nodded, thinking how often she had been that someone, the one who had to stay calm when everything around her fell apart. Later that day, as the sun began to set, she found herself still there, long after most workers had left. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint smell of fresh cement. She sat in her chair near the edge of the site, watching the building glow in the last light. He walked over with 2 cups of tea and handed her one. "You look like you need this," he said. She smiled. "You always seem to know." "Not hard to tell," he replied. "You get that same look I do after a long day." They sat in silence for a while, sipping tea and watching the workers leave. She found peace in those moments. No business talk, no expectations. Just quiet understanding. Then he said something she didn't expect. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were untouchable." She looked at him curiously. "Untouchable?" "Yeah, you walk, well, roll, into every space like you own it. Everyone looks at you like you're something more than human." He paused. "But you're not, are you?" "No," she said softly. "I'm not." There was no sadness in her voice this time, only honesty. For once, she didn't have to pretend. He nodded, understanding without needing to say anything more. The next few days, they worked closely on final design decisions. He showed her different finishes, materials, and textures for the new building. She admired his attention to detail, how he noticed things others didn't. Once she asked him why he was so particular. He smiled. Because the little things last the longest. People forget the big speeches and grand openings, but they remember how a place makes them feel. His words stuck with her. That night she thought about how that applied to her life too. The little things, the quiet mornings, the kind gestures, the moments of laughter. Those were what stayed, not the awards or the applause. A week later, she had an important presentation to investors. Everything had to go perfectly, but that morning her wheelchair malfunctioned. The motor stalled, and no matter how hard she tried, it wouldn't move. Frustration burned in her chest. She hated asking for help, hated feeling powerless. Before she could call anyone, there was a knock at her office door. It was him. He had stopped by to drop off some documents. Seeing her struggle, he immediately walked over. "What happened?" he asked. "The chair's dead," she said with a sigh, "and I have a meeting in 20 minutes. "Let me take a look," he said, kneeling beside it. He checked the switches, the wheels, the wires, calm and focused. Within minutes, he found the issue and fixed it. When the chair moved again, she looked at him in disbelief. "You just saved my day," she said with a small laugh. "Glad I could help," he replied, smiling. "You save mine all the time. It's fair." She laughed again, a genuine laugh that echoed softly through the room. When he left, she realized how rare that had become. Laughing without thinking, smiling without effort. After the presentation, she couldn't stop thinking about him. There was something about his quiet confidence that pulled her in. He wasn't trying to impress her or fix her. He simply treated her like she mattered. Not as a CEO, not as a woman in a wheelchair, but as a person. One evening, she decided to thank him properly. She invited him to dinner. Not a fancy restaurant, just a small place by the waterfront that she used to visit before her accident. He looked surprised, but accepted. That night, as they sat by the water, the city lights reflecting in the waves, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. They talked about everything. Life, dreams, the future. He told her about his daughter's drawings, how she wanted to be an artist someday. She told him about her fears, how she often felt trapped in her own strength, afraid to let anyone see her weak. He listened quietly, then said, "You don't have to be strong all the time. Sometimes being human is enough." She looked at him, and for a moment she couldn't speak. His words touched something deep inside her. All her life she had built walls, around her heart, her pain, her hope. And now, sitting beside him, those walls started to crumble. After dinner, he helped her into her car, then stepped back and said, "You know, I think you're learning to stand already." She smiled. "I wish that were true." "It is," he said softly, "just not the way you think." That night, as she lay in bed, she replayed his words over and over. Maybe standing again didn't mean walking. Maybe it meant opening her heart, trusting again, believing that not everyone would leave when things got hard. In the following weeks, she started physical therapy again. It had been years since she'd tried, but something inside her said it was time. She didn't tell him at first. She wanted to see if she could do it, not to prove anything, but for herself. The first few sessions were painful. Her body resisted every movement. There were moments she wanted to quit. But then she'd remember his voice, calm and steady, saying, "You're learning to stand already." Each time she fell, she pictured his quiet confidence. And slowly she began to improve. Not big changes, just tiny moments of progress that no one else noticed but her. One afternoon, she invited him to meet her at the rehabilitation center. When he arrived, she was standing, leaning on parallel bars, her legs trembling, her arms shaking, but she was standing. His eyes widened in surprise, then softened with pride. "I told you," he said quietly. "You could." She smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. "I didn't believe you then." "Well," he said gently, "you do now." That moment changed everything. It wasn't just about her legs. It was about hope, about believing that life still had more to give. After that day, they grew even closer. He became her quiet supporter, always there without being asked. Sometimes he'd show up with flowers, sometimes with a new playlist of songs she might like, sometimes with nothing but time, and that was enough. She had spent years chasing perfection, success, and control. Now she was learning that the most beautiful things often come quietly, in the form of someone who simply stays. And deep down, She knew her story was only beginning to change. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was living again. The early morning light spilled softly through the wide windows of the therapy center. The air inside smelled faintly of disinfectant and new hope. She sat quietly in her wheelchair, waiting for the session to start, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. For years, she had avoided this place, and the smell, the struggle, the pain, all of it reminded her of failure. But now she wasn't here because someone told her to be. She was here because she wanted to be. When she first told him she was going back to therapy, he didn't say much. He just smiled and said, "I'll be there if you need me." She didn't expect him to actually show up, but he did, sitting quietly in the back corner of the room as she began her exercises. He never interfered, never made her feel small. He just sat there calm and steady, like a quiet force reminding her she wasn't alone. The first few sessions were brutal. Her legs trembled, her body ached, and her mind screamed at her to quit. Every time she tried to push herself up, it felt like her body was betraying her. But every time she looked up, she saw him. His eyes never wavered. He wasn't cheering loudly or making grand gestures. He was just there, patient and present. And somehow that was enough. One day, after a particularly rough session, she sat in her chair, sweat running down her neck, her arms shaking. The therapist stepped away to get some water, and he walked over. "You did great," he said softly. She shook her head. "I didn't even stand for 5 seconds," he smiled a little. "You stood for 4. That's 4 more than yesterday." His words made her laugh through her frustration. That's what he did best. Turned her failures into small victories. She didn't know how he managed to make her feel proud even when she felt weak. Weeks passed, and little by little her progress grew. She could stand longer, balance better, and even take a step while holding the bars. It wasn't much, but it was something. Each time she succeeded, she saw the pride in his eyes. Not the kind of pride that pitied her, but the kind that celebrated her strength. Outside therapy, their friendship had deepened in quiet ways. Sometimes he'd drive her home after sessions and they'd talk about anything but work. He told her stories about his daughter's school plays, the little victories that made him laugh, and the nights he stayed up helping her with homework. She told him about her early days as a businesswoman, how scared she was at first, and how every mistake taught her something new. One evening, as they drove home, rain started to fall, soft at first, then heavier. The sound filled the silence in the car. She looked out the window, watching the city lights blur behind raindrops. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to hate rain. It reminds me of the accident." He glanced at her for a moment, then back at the road. "Maybe it's time to give it a new memory." She turned to him, curious. "How do you do that?" "By living through it again," he said simply. "This time on your own terms." Those words stuck with her. She thought about them all night. For years, she had avoided the things that reminded her of her pain. The rain, the roads, even certain songs. But now, maybe it was time to face them differently. A few days later, during another session, she tried standing without the bars for the first time. It was terrifying. Her arms trembled, her knees wobbled, and she could feel her balance slipping. But before she fell, he was there, steadying her gently. "You've got this," he said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried strength. She took a deep breath, focused, and stood again. For a few seconds, she was upright. No bars, no support, just her own strength and will. Then she sank back into the chair, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were relief. He crouched beside her, smiling. "See, you stood. You did it." She nodded, laughing through her tears. "It feels like flying," she whispered. After that day, her progress moved faster. She began to believe in herself again, not as the strong CEO who controlled everything, but as a woman who could rebuild, one step at a time. Their connection grew deeper, too. Sometimes, when she was too exhausted to talk, he'd just sit beside her, both of them watching the sun go down outside the window. They didn't need words. The silence between them was comfortable, full of understanding. One Friday evening after therapy, they decided to walk. Well, she rolled, and he walked, through a nearby park. The air was cool, filled with the smell of flowers and the soft sound of leaves rustling. Families laughed in the distance, children played, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was part of the world again, not just watching it from behind glass walls. They stopped by a small lake, watching the ripples on the water. She said quietly, I used to come here before everything changed. I stopped after the accident. It just hurt too much. He looked out at the lake and said, "Then it's good you came back. You're taking your life back piece by piece." She smiled, her voice soft. "I couldn't have done it without you." He shook his head. "You're the one doing the work. I'm just here to remind you what you're capable of." His humility always touched her. He never took credit, never tried to make himself the hero. He simply supported her, and somehow that made him even more important. One day, her therapist suggested she try walking a few steps with braces. The idea terrified her. It had been years since she had truly walked, and even the thought made her heart race. But she agreed. When the day came, he showed up early, waiting by the door with quiet anticipation. As she stood between the parallel bars, her hands gripping tightly, she looked at him. He nodded once, wordlessly encouraging her. She took a deep breath and shifted her weight forward. Her body screamed in protest, but she kept moving. One step, then another, and then another. The room erupted in soft applause from the staff, but all she could see was him, his eyes filled with pride and tears he tried to hide. When she reached the end of the bars, she turned to him, breathing hard, her voice shaking. "I did it," he smiled, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, you did." In that moment, she realized something. It wasn't just about walking. It was about everything, her life, her choices, her courage. For years, she had been living half a life, trapped in her own fear. But now, she was free. Later that evening, she sat alone in her apartment, staring out at the city lights. For the first time, she didn't feel broken. She felt strong. Not the kind of strength that came from power or success, but the quiet strength that comes from surviving what once seemed impossible. He called her that night, just to check if she was okay. "I'm fine," she said with a soft smile he couldn't see. "Better than fine. I knew you would be," he said. "You always were." They talked for hours about everything and nothing. When she hung up, she felt a peace she hadn't felt in years. The next morning, she arrived at the site for one final inspection before the project's completion. The building stood tall and gleaming, a reflection of months of work and resilience. As she looked up at it, she realized it symbolized more than business success. It represented her rebuilding, her courage, her second chance. He joined her, standing beside her in silence. After a while, he said quietly, "It's beautiful." "It is," she said. "We built this together." He smiled. "You built it." "I just held the ladder," she laughed softly, shaking her head. "No, you helped me stand." He didn't reply, but the way he looked at her said everything. As they watched the sunset reflect off the glass walls of the building, she knew her life had changed forever. She still had work to do, still had fears to face, but she was no longer afraid. She had learned to stand not just on her feet, but in her life. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of something far greater than she had ever planned. The day of the company's annual event arrived, and the city seemed to sparkle with excitement. Inside the tall office building she had helped create, everything was in place. Lights gleaming, decorations carefully set, and a crowd of employees and investors buzzing with anticipation. For years she had faced events like this from a seated position, commanding attention with words but always aware of her own limitations. Today everything felt different. She looked at herself in the mirror one last time before stepping out, adjusting her suit and taking a deep breath. Her legs were steady. Her posture was tall, confident, upright. She had worked so hard not just to be here as the CEO, but to reclaim a part of herself she had thought was lost forever. The journey had been painful, exhausting, and emotional, but she had made it. She had stood again, not just physically, but emotionally and in every part of her life that had felt confined. He was waiting outside the event hall. When she saw him, she felt a familiar warmth. He didn't look at her with pity, admiration, or any of the shallow expressions she had grown used to from others. He looked at her with quiet pride, a smile playing at the corners of his lips, eyes reflecting a deep respect she had never experienced before. "You ready?" he asked softly. She nodded, gripping her clutch tightly, and together they walked into the hall. The room seemed to hold its breath. Employees and guests turned to see her enter. The applause began, hesitant at first, then growing into a powerful wave that filled the space. She smiled, walking with calm assurance, each step a testament to her struggle, her determination, and the journey she had endured to get here. When she reached the stage, she paused, letting the applause wash over her. She saw familiar faces in the crowd, employees who had supported her through thick and thin, investors who had believed in her vision, and her staff, who had watched her rise above challenges with a quiet resilience. But her eyes quickly found him. He stood at the edge of the crowd, smiling, watching her as if she were the only person in the room. That simple gaze reminded her of every moment they had shared, every struggle, every victory, every quiet conversation that had helped her reclaim her life. She began her speech, her voice steady and clear. She spoke of courage, perseverance, and the importance of kindness. She talked about the journey of building a company, yes, but also the journey of rebuilding herself. She didn't shy away from sharing the challenges she had faced, the moments she had felt weak, and the times she had feared that life would never be the same. Her words resonated with the audience, who listened not just to the story of a CEO, but to the story of a human being who had overcome pain, self-doubt, and fear. As she spoke, she felt a shift inside her. This was more than a professional milestone. This was personal triumph. Every word she shared, every glance she made across the room, carried the weight of the journey she had undertaken. And as she mentioned the importance of support and encouragement, she felt a subtle warmth from his direction. She knew he understood. He had been there for every step, sometimes silently, sometimes with gentle words that had pushed her forward. When the applause ended, she stepped down from the stage. She felt a hand on her shoulder. He was there, his presence steady, comforting, and familiar. "You were amazing," he said simply. "Thanks," she replied, smiling. Her voice held a quiet emotion that words alone could not convey. "I couldn't have done it without everything you've done," he shook his head. "No, you did this yourself. I just reminded you what you were capable of." She looked into his eyes, feeling the depth of sincerity. For so long she had been surrounded by people who judged her based on success, appearance, or status. But he had never done that. He had seen her, truly seen her, and that had changed everything. After the event, as the crowd began to disperse, she found a quiet moment with him in a hallway. The room was empty, and the soft glow of the lights reflected off the polished floor. She turned to him, taking a breath. "I want to thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Not just for helping me walk again, but for helping me live again." He stepped closer, eyes gentle. "You've always been able to do it," he said. "I just helped you remember." She shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "No. You helped me see that I could stand not just on my feet, but in life. I had forgotten what it meant to trust, to hope, to believe in myself again. You gave me that." He smiled softly. "And you've given yourself the rest. I'm just here to witness it." The moment between them was quiet, powerful, and real. There were no grand declarations or dramatic gestures, only the understanding that their bond had grown into something meaningful, built on trust, support, and shared humanity. In the weeks that followed, life continued in its new rhythm. She continued her therapy, now stronger and more confident, not just physically but emotionally. She walked with a grace and assurance she had never known before. Each morning she started her day not just as a CEO, but as someone who had reclaimed her own life. He remained by her side, not as a constant presence demanding attention, but as a quiet anchor, someone who reminded her of the strength she possessed. Sometimes they would sit together after work, talking about the day, sharing small laughs, and enjoying the simple moments that had become precious to them. One weekend, they visited the park where she had first begun to rebuild her confidence. The sun was warm and the air carried the smell of blooming flowers. Children played in the distance and the world seemed calm. She walked, slowly but steadily, taking each step with care and confidence. He walked beside her, matching her pace, his presence reassuring and comforting. "You've come so far," he said, watching her stride. She smiled, feeling the truth of his words in every muscle and bone. "I never thought I could," she admitted. "But somehow I did. Because you wanted it," he said, "and because you allowed yourself to be helped." They stopped by a small bench near a pond, sitting together in the quiet. She watched the ripples on the water and reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The pain, the struggles, the countless moments of doubt, and the quiet encouragement that had helped her stand again. "You know," she said softly, "I never imagined someone could make such a difference in my life. Not by changing me, but by simply being there." He turned to her, his eyes kind. Sometimes that's all anyone needs. Just someone to remind them they can do it. You did all the hard work. I just reminded you to believe. She reached out and touched his hand, a gesture of gratitude and connection that carried more weight than words ever could. Thank you, she whispered. He squeezed her hand gently, understanding the depth of her emotion. Always, he said. As the sun set, casting golden hues across the park, she realized something profound. Life wasn't about perfection or control. It was about moments like this. Small, quiet, human moments of connection, trust, and support. It was about standing again, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and with purpose. Weeks turned into months, and the company flourished. She led with renewed confidence, inspiring her team not just through success, but through her story. A story of resilience, courage, and the quiet power of human connection. She shared her journey carefully, not for attention or sympathy, but to remind others that even the strongest people sometimes need someone to help them stand again. He remained an integral part of her life, not as a savior, but as a partner in the quiet victories that made life meaningful. Their bond was built on honesty, support, and respect, a foundation stronger than anything she had ever known. One evening, as they looked out over the city skyline from her office, she reflected on how far she had come. The pain of the past still lingered in memories, but it no longer controlled her. She had learned to face challenges, embrace support, and trust herself once more. And in that trust, she found freedom. She turned to him, her heart full. I never thought I could feel this alive again, she said quietly. You always could, he replied, his voice calm and steady. You just needed to see it yourself. They sat in silence for a long while, watching the city lights twinkle. No words were necessary. The journey had been hard, the victories small and often unseen. But it had led to something profound. A life reclaimed, a heart opened, and a bond that reminded them both of the power of hope, trust, and standing together. And as the night settled over the city, she knew with a quiet certainty that she was no longer just the CEO who had survived an accident. She was a woman who had faced her fears, rebuilt her life, and found the one person who had helped her stand again, not by lifting her, but by walking beside her when she needed it most. Life would continue to challenge her, but she was ready. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that strength was not measured by how far you could go alone, but by how willing you were to let someone help you rise again. And in that truth, she found peace, courage, and a love that wasn't about perfection, but about being truly seen, truly supported, and truly alive.